In this clip, we see B-17s under attack from German bomber interceptors. The fighters are tearing into the formations with machine gun and cannon fire. By summer 1943, it was clear that unescorted daylight bombing over the Reich was not sustainable, given the high bomber losses. The two paths to mitigate bomber losses was either to limit the bomber's range to the range of existing escorts or shift to nighttime bombing. The other tried bomber loss mitigation option was to mix in heavily armed and armored B-17s into the formations to act as escorts. The YB-40s were sent with the B-17s on 17 bomber missions in May, June, and July 1943. The trial program was considered a failure, as documented in this channel's video. The intent of this video is to review the reasons why the 8th Air Forces did not pursue shifting to nighttime bombing. Consideration to shifting bombing from day to night is discussed on this page from a declassified 1953 U.S. Air Force Historical Studies No. 92 document titled Development of Night Operations 1941 to 1952. These historical study reports are the gold standard of collected World War II lessons learned, historical data, and events. Air Force personnel are to draw on these documented experiences in preparation for future conflicts so mistakes will not be repeated. Due to high bomber losses during the summer and fall of 1943, the U.S. may have to shift to night bombing if long-range fighter escorts are not available. Night bombing may inflict higher U.S. bomber losses from operational mistakes and enemy action. Operational losses come from nighttime mid-air collisions and nighttime landing accidents. U.S. crews were unprepared and undertrained for nighttime duties. To mitigate the risk, General Acre ordered a squadron crew to be trained to operate at night and their B-17s be modified for night bombing missions. The U.S. was unprepared for night air operations when World War II started. Little to no night bombing training had occurred. Navigators lacked nighttime competence without navigational aids. Bombardiers were trained to drop bombs on targets that were illuminated. Bomb release by Pathfinder and radar would not be available until September 1943, as shown on this chart from a 1946 U.S. Air Force Historical Studies document titled The Combined Bomber Offensive, April through December 1943. During Pathfinder bombing, the formations will release their bombs when the group lead releases their bombs. The group lead usually will release their bombs by sighting the target by radar. U.S. bombers did not have design features for nighttime bombing. U.S. leadership pushback to shifting to nighttime bombing is summarized on this page. Post-war, General Arnold wrote, "We don't quite know how to make daylight precision bombing work, but we will make it work." Notice he did not say unescorted daylight precision bombing, just daylight precision bombing. In June 1943, a commander of the 5th Bombardment Wing recommended nighttime bombing of the German Ruhr Valley to reduce bomber losses, since no long-range fighter escort was available. This request was rejected with the response, shifting from daylight precision bombing to nighttime area bombing would be an admission of a flawed U.S. bombing policy commitment to daytime precision target bombing. Admission of this policy error led to the continuation of daylight bombing with associated bomber losses. Bombing policy had become an issue of national pride to some degree. After the high losses suffered during the October 1943 Schweinfurt II ball bearing factory raid, daylight precision bombing was continued, but somewhat limited to targets within the range of existing fighter escorts. The following pages outline bomber nighttime crew training requirements and operational challenges. The 472nd Squadron B-17 crews were trained for nighttime bombing. In the fall of 1943, a squadron consisted of 2 elements, or 6 planes total. Bombardiers will release their bombs by Pathfinders. Pilots require extensive nighttime takeoff and landing training, and evasive action required when coned by German searchlights or under fighter attack. Bomber gunners need training of maintaining night vision in combat and gunnery procedures while in evasive maneuvers. Since the trial missions will be flown with the RAF, radio operators need to become familiar with British radio operating procedures and more navigator coordination. Nighttime navigation was the greatest challenge. Daylight navigation is relatively easy in comparison. It will take more than just a few night flights to be proficient in nighttime navigation. The safety of the crew and plane is critically dependent on the navigator's skill in maintaining the plane's position within a 15-mile wide corridor. Mission success also depends on the plane's navigator. A poorly timed and executed attack will likely lead to mission failure. The plane's position is dependent on the navigator, relying on precise dead reckoning and astrostar fix calculations. Bombing was conducted by targeting the geographical center of either ground markers or sky markers. Crews struggled to locate objects on the ground, even if illuminated. This was due to the high altitude the B-17s flew. In addition to the extensive crew training required, B-17s were heavily modified to convert from day to night bombing, as described on this page. The B-17 was unsuited for night bombing unless it was modified. 10 navigational modifications would be required, which took 82.5 man-hours to implement. New antenna loading units and G navigational units needed to be installed in the bomber. Window blackout curtain, swapping the 19 non-illuminated with illuminated dials and gauges, which took 125.5 hours to make these changes. 6 major armament changes were required, including adding a more restrictive fire cutoff cams to the guns to keep the gunners from shooting their own plane when in a violent maneuver, like escaping a searchlight. The ball turret's K4 computing gun sight was too bright and needs to be replaced with the non-computing British Mark III gun sight. This image shows the ball turret's K4 gun sight versus the British Mark III reflector gun sight. The ball turret's windows need to be blacked out, except for the forward sighting window, and the ammo needs to be better secured. These windows would need to be blacked out. This modification would greatly reduce a ball turret gunner's visibility. The flexible guns would also need to be fitted with new nighttime compatible gun sights. All guns need flash muzzle hinders to cut down on muzzle flash, which would blind the gunners. The 472nd Bomb Squadron indicated bombers modified for either day or night bombing cannot be used for dual roles without a loss of combat effectiveness. The first B-17 nighttime attack mission occurred on the night of September 10th, 11th, 1943. No Flak fighters attacked the B-17 since they were flying at a high 28,000-foot altitude. 2 more bombing missions over France and then Hanover, Germany, all without losses. Up to this point, it seemed there were advantages to night area bombing due to the light German response. Bombers were again sent to Hanover 5 days later. This time, crews were coned by searchlights and attacked by fighters. A plane was lost on this mission. 2 planes were lost during the next 2 missions. The 422nd Squadron lost 3 night-modified B-17s during the 8 bombing missions, where a total of 35 effective bombing sorties had been flown. The nighttime bombing loss rate equated to 8.6%. However, this loss rate equates to 16.6% when the target was Germany. This compares to a daytime bomber crew loss rate of 7.27% when attacking Germany over the same period, as shown on this table from a March 1944 Headquarters 8th Air Force document titled Relief of Combat Crew Personnel. The nighttime sortie loss rate was over 2 times the sortie loss rate of day missions. The last and 8th trial night bombing mission occurred on October 4, 1943. Crew experiences to night bombing was influenced by the level of German reaction. Crews whose sorties encountered little to no flak, fighters, and searchlights welcomed night bombing. However, those missions where the bomber was coned by a searchlight for 5 minutes were wanting to return to daylight missions. B-17 gunners were unable to see any distances outside their windows, experienced a drop in morale. Night bombing missions were thought in less regard to day missions, and combat losses were greater than in day bombing missions. Channel commentary. The effect of searchlights on bomber crews is profound and can be terrifying, as discussed in the Channel Searchlight video. This page from a 1942 War Department Military Intelligence Services document titled Tactical and Technical Trends outlines the effect searchlight coning had on British bomber crews. This includes responsible for bringing down fighters and bombers, blinding crewmen, making target acquisition difficult, impairing return of night vision, and having a pronounced negative psychological effect on the crew. The 6 reasons why the 8th Air Forces did not shift to nighttime bombing are summarized on this page. U.S. bombing policy is based on precision bombing of targets, not area bombing. Precision bombing can only occur during the day, given the limited target acquisition sighting at night. The B-17s would need extensive modification to configure them for night bombing. Bomber crews would require extensive training. When the night-modified B-17s did bomb at night, their loss rate exceeded the day missions. Night combat-trained experienced Germans were expected to make quick work of inexperienced U.S. night-deployed bombers. Since the RAF had experience in night bombing, best to continue U.S. daylight bombing to fulfill the around-the-clock combined bomber offensive goals. The channel adds a 7th item. Long-range fighter escorts were just around 3 months away, which would mitigate the fighter threat. Bomber crew attrition dropped from 7.27% in the summer and winter of 1943 to 4.22% in February 1944, when long-range fighter escorts became available. During this 3-month window, the 8th Air Force's bombing policy adopted to somewhat limit bomber attacks to the limited range of the escorts until a critical mass of long-range escorts were available seemed the most prudent course of action, rather than shifting to night bombing given the reasons listed. Do you agree that shifting the 8th Air Forces from day to night bombing was not a viable option given the 7 reasons listed, and the course of action taken was the most rational? If you've enjoyed this deep dive video outlining the reasons why the 8th Air Forces did not shift to nighttime bombing, please consider commenting, liking, and/or subscribing to the channel World War II U.S. Bombers.